Thank you, Aaron. I'm excited to be here this morning, and I'd like to extend a big thank you to the Credit Union Association for your partnership over the last few years here, and excited that we can bring subject matter experts to the benefit of the membership. I would, at this time, welcome and excited to introduce to you Mr. Tony Sagar, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Evangelist for CIS, the Center for Internet Security. He leads the development of the CIS controls. It's a worldwide consensus project to find and support technical best practices in cybersecurity. Sagar champions the use of these controls, and others gleaned from their cyber attacks that have happened across the globe from their global defense systems. Sagar is retired from the National Security Agency, the NSA, after 34 years as an information assurance professional. He started his career there in communications, ComSec, in the intern program, and worked as a mathematical cryptographer and a software vulnerability analyst. In 2001, Sagar led the release of the NSA security guidance to the public. He expanded the NSA's role in the development of the open standards for security. Sagar's awards and commendations at the NSA include the Presidential Rank Award at the meritorious level twice, and the NSA Exceptional Civilian Award. The group he has led at the NSA were also widely recognized for technical and missional excellence with the awards from numerous industry sources, including SANS, Science Magazine, the Government Executive Magazine as well. Mr. Sagar holds a BA in mathematics from Western Maryland College and an MS in computer science from the Johns Hopkins University. It is my pleasure to welcome to you this morning, Mr. Tony Sagar.
Thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate the very kind introduction. It's amazing how the time has flown, in the career that I've had. And I'll be retired 10 years in about a month. So I'm not sure how it all happened, but it's been an amazing ride. So thanks everyone for giving your time and attention today. It's really an honor to talk to you. Let me bring up a presentation here and talk to you a little bit about this business of cybersecurity and the observations built over some decades now in working in this kind of stuff. And I'll explain this title, Lifting the Fog of More. It really was a kind of a theme that I started using some number of years ago to explain the situation that we're in. So as mentioned, I had a long career in government. I was, as they say at NSA, we were cyber before cyber was cool, but we called it things like ComSec, information security, information assurance, defensive information operations. There's a whole basket full of buzzwords that talked about the kinds of problems that we were trying to deal with, everything from confidentiality and the mathematics underlying security, all the way through protocols, testing of products, and out to and including the field testing, live testing of operational systems, is where I spent kind of the last third of my time. So a lot of chances to see what was going on out there. And as I said, at least at one point, I think in the US government, I got to see systems fail at a greater scale than the average person. I got to see how things break, how they can be manipulated, how bad guys do things to us and so forth. So try to encapsulate all of that into a series of lessons learned, and we'll talk about some of those and how that shapes the work that I've done ever since retirement with the Center for Internet Security. Just for quick background, if you've never heard of the center, it's okay. We're a small but mighty nonprofit company headquartered in New York State. I work from home in the DC area, but we have two main lines of business. One is we are the multi-state ISAC. We operate that. And if you don't know what that is, ISAC is an acronym for Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So think of us as a kind of a co-op of, we're currently at 14,000 state, local, tribal, territorial governments, all working together to share cyber incidents, best practices, learn from each other, spot the trends and what bad things are happening together. We're also the home of the Election Infrastructure ISAC, which is closely related, obviously, to state and local governments. A very similar mission, relatively new, just in the last 3 years, and you can imagine the kind of activity that goes on in election security. The other major part of CIS, which is really what the focus today, is around best practices. How do we know what we should do about all these problems that are out there? So I'll walk you through a little bit of history, a little bit of lessons, and then how we translate that into action here today. But let me share with you, did you ever see a quote? I've done a lot of public speaking. Have you ever seen a quote so good you wish you had said it first? Well, here's the one for me. There's a friend of mine, he's a name guy in the business with CrowdStrike, and he was at the FBI at the time, and I saw him quoted in the paper, and I said, I had to call him. I said, Sean, did you really say this? It's really good. Can I borrow it? And he said, of course. Anyone in organized crime who's not getting into this cyber stuff ought to be sued for malpractice. And I said, come on, give me the story. He goes, Tony, why would you run into a bank, pull a gun, put your life at risk, when for a fraction of the risk, you could get many times the return? And if you're not smart enough to pull this off on your own, you're certainly mean enough to kidnap somebody or convince somebody to do it for you. This, of course, this is where the criminals are going to go. This is where the money is. This is the equivalent of, we rob banks because that's where the money is. And, it was a clever quote, but it was a really serious intent, right? Bad guys are not going away. This is where our economy operates. This is where your money is stored. This is where we share information. And so the ability to dominate that, and that's the term that's used in government, is really the key to success, both in a business sense, but also in a national security sense. So this life then, pardon me. So this fog of war thing, this was something, if you were in the Defense Department at one point, most of us who were in executive jobs had to read that book that's referenced on there, The Fog of War. And the story there, it was a serious examination of what was then known as the coming information age. This access to tons of information. I grew up in a world where the government was sort of the source of knowledge, right, about adversaries, their intentions, their capabilities. But then we saw the rise of the internet, the 24/7 news cycle, and this massive infusion of information from all over the place, and of uncertain quality, uncertain time duration, but just tremendous sources of understanding. But it makes high-risk decision making really tricky. And that was the theme of the book, right? How do we understand what's available to us? How do we make sense? And most importantly, how do we make decisions? Because the purpose of information is not to just get more of it, but it's to support the kind of things we're trying to do as a government agency or as a business. And so I gave a talk at the RSA conference, which is the big trade show in cybersecurity. I forgot which year, but this was the theme of it, the fog of war. And the point I was making is this: it's not the lack of good solutions, it's not the lack of training, it's not the certifications and so forth. It's actually the surplus. We're overwhelmed by the problem. And if you saw the abstract for this talk, right, never in our history, I mean, I've been doing this for about as long as anybody you'll meet, never in our history have we had so many tools, so much information, so many people, so much to work with as defenders. And yet we're not getting better. In fact, the problem's getting worse faster than we are getting better. It's really about, we're overwhelmed by the problem. There's too much noise. There's a noisy marketplace. There's the hack of the month, the crisis of the week, and people are just overwhelmed by this. And so being overwhelmed is not a reason to give up. It's a reason to look for what are the core elements, what are the most important things to do. And that's really what the talk and what my career has been about. So I'll share with you briefly, these are my lessons from a cyber life. And I hope they provide some insight to you, and they'll certainly help you understand where I come from. So my job at NSA, I worked in defense for 35 years, but always in security testing. So if you know terms like penetration testing, red team testing, blue team testing, that's my life. 0 days, finding flaws in software. That's what a software vulnerability analyst did in my day at NSA. And our job was to find them as part of a life cycle of development, for example, of the next generation of Army radio, or the messaging switches and all the kind of technology that goes with what we now know as the internet. And the notion, it's important to understand these flaws, right? Because these are complicated systems that change all the time. But the notion was, if we just pointed out flaws, well, people will be inspired, or they'll be scared or something, and they'll eventually fix them. But it took me a while to figure out that never really happened. People were impressed by folks that found flaws because it takes a certain cleverness and skill to do so. But it turns out the keys to fixing flaws have much more to do with incentives and behavior and the environment that people work in, right? What does the boss care about? And so they would be impressed by like an NSA red team and be amazed at the results. But fixing them was a whole different problem that involved the management of IT and resources and convincing bosses and convincing auditors. And so again, thinking then again, how do I frame flaws in a way not to make them clearer, but to point naturally to the solutions became really a consuming activity for me. There's also a tendency in this business to think that we're all special and unique, and security frameworks are typically designed that way, right? You should, and we design these sort of processes to go through. Well, what is my IT, and what is what's called the risk appetite of my executives, and what is the regulatory environment that I have to live in, et cetera. And we tend to focus on all the things that we have that are unique. And there are unique things in enterprises, but frankly, we all have more in common than we do that's different. That is, we're essentially using the same technology on the same network. We're interlocked in these complicated, changing business relationships. And so, when a problem affects one of us, it's more than a bumper sticker, it affects all of us. And so often we don't understand those complexities or those dependencies. But again, if you think of this as if we have more in common, there's a certain risk to that, right? A problem that affects one affects all. But there's also opportunity there to say, well, what are the root cause issues? What do we have in common? And can we push towards common solutions? Do we expect every enterprise to solve these problems on their own, or what things really belong to the infrastructure or to the government or to the service provider? So commonality has both sides of the coin, but really focusing on how it can help empower defense is really important activity. And there's also a tendency, and again, having grown up in this business, to think, well, the bad guy doesn't perform magic. Ooh, it's called advanced persistent threat, right? We're helpless against them, or the nation state adversary. And guess what? Professional bad guys are good at what they do. Don't let me kid you. They are good at what they do because they're professionals, right? They have time and resources and training and tooling. But almost all attacks are repeats of known patterns, right? This is another thing that we all have more in common. And so if you think of the world as full of millions of unique attacks happening over and over again, and we just can't, we can't figure out magic. If you treat this as magic, your only defense is magic, right? Is to hire your own magicians. But when you do the analysis, and anyone who's done any analysis of this knows, almost attacks are repeats of known patterns. So that's bad, right? We're getting hit by the same things over and over again. You think we'd figure this out by now, but it's also opportunity. That is, by understanding the patterns, and not all of us have to understand them, but we need to do enough analysis to understand what are the patterns, what are the root cause issues that they have in common, what are the opportunities to interrupt the bad guy. Right? We can't build magic and perfection, but we can professionally think about how do we improve the entire ecosystem, or improve the service providers, or what comes out of the vendors, or our integration of those tools into our work environments. And so it's really important to think of this and understand that the bad guy is important to understand. And good news is, back in the 70s and 80s, in my early days, that was all about the government doing the analysis. Now it's like, wow, we have so much data. Everyone's involved in this, right? The analysis is happening across the entire industry. So it's really important to take a look at that, and we will. I'll show you how we use that. There's another lesson learned for me that, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the defensive choices in front of us, but really, there's a large number, but there's a limited number. And if you're familiar with the term, the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle, I believe it strongly applies in cybersecurity. And roughly all you have to know is most of your value, i.e. the magical 80% of your value or your outcome, is driven by 20% of your inputs or your choices. Think of it that way. And so it's really important to choose wisely, to choose sort of your first few steps so you get the most value, with the foundational steps upon which you can build the other things. We don't want people reinventing the wheel or rediscovering the basics over and over again. We want to get people focused on what early choices give you lots of value. And there's great opportunities for that, and we'll talk about that. Then another point I'll make is that cyber defense, at its heart, having been a part of this for my whole life, is, we tend to think, well, we could just buy the right tool. If we just had the right technology to protect the information, if we just got the right threat feed from the right vendor, we would know what to do and we would do it. Those are all important, but they're not the heart of cyber defense, which is really about managing information, right? It's all getting information, but also translating it into action. And how do I move it from sort of information to blocking a thing at my perimeter, or reconfiguring a device, or what specifically do I want my operators to do when they see a certain condition that occurs in their technology? So, it's a trendy in DC. You always say everything is about share. We have to get everyone to share. And hey, sharing is good. I got it. But we're not trying to build an industry of sharing. We're trying to build an industry of action, right? What do we do? So the most important verb is always, to me, is always translate. How do we translate millions of data points of badness into a relatively small number of positive, constructive things that you can do about it? That's why you would read these threat reports. That's why you would bring in consultants to help you think about this. It's about translation. And again, the opportunity, given the repeats of known patterns, the need to focus on prioritization and defense, you don't have to do that translation alone, right? You can do it as part of a group, as part of a community. You can look to folks like us, and I'll share that also. And then finally, and now I think if you follow the logic, you're with me, right? Cybersecurity is not an event. It's really a machine, right? We need tools, we need training, we need great practitioners. All that's important, but we're designing an information-driven machine. That's really the way to think about it. If you like cheesy old science fiction movies, which I absolutely do, the quick quip is that I use is, we wish cyber defense were like Independence Day. Remember the movie? I guess I can still talk about Will Smith. Remember that the alien mothership is out there. We have a captured alien scout craft. Brilliant people reverse engineer it. The heroes get into the craft, heroically, deliver it up to the mothership, deliver the virus that they've invented, escape in the nick of time. Boom goes the alien mothership, the heroes return. You could just imagine, and they're gonna have a parade, right? It's over. We've solved the problem out there. We've solved the problem through heroic action, through brilliant reverse engineering. We should have a parade for the good guys. Well, I've been in cyber defense 45 years. No parade for the good guys, as near as I can tell. It's never happened, right? Because it never ends. The cybersecurity business is much more like the other movie referenced here. It's Groundhog Day. Pardon me. Over and over again. Remember Bill Murray, right? Wake up every day, replay the same day. Think of cyber defense, and don't be quite as hopeless as poor Bill was. But remember, he started learning, right? He was building a feedback loop. He got better. He would make changes and see what the effect would be. He was running an information-driven machine. And that's really closer to the heart of cybersecurity. And it's more than a cutesy story, right? Once you start designing a machine, you start to think about, well, what are the inputs? And how do I optimize my machine, right? How do I remove inefficiencies from it? What are the outputs? And are the outputs in a form to drive the next stage of the machine, right? Sending people email, for example, with threat indicators, that's not actionable information. In the best case, that's readable information. But a human being still has to read it, interpret it, decide if it makes sense to them. And that's inefficiency in your machine. And so the goal is, translation allows us to translate into a form that really drives the next machine down the line, is kind of the way to think of it. So this is my lifetime of security lessons, but let me just share a couple things with you. If I could tell you a little bit about my career again, and this is not about me, I promise you. Roughly speaking, my career could be divided conceptually into thirds, right? So this first third was, again, at a really unique and special place, the National Security Agency. The first third was about learning the technical craft of finding vulnerabilities in the name of defense. I'm my career was a bit of an anomaly at the NSA. Whatever you think of NSA, it's an amazing institution. But I'm one of the very few people who worked their entire career in defense and never worked in signals intelligence or in offense. But the first third was about learning technical craft, right? And at that time, that was the place to learn that kind of stuff at NSA. And it was about the mathematics, but also computer science, engineering, signal theory. When nations attack each other, all bets are off. And so it's really a full spectrum kind of activity. And you got to meet some amazing scientists and participate in some amazing work. The second third was about managing organizations. As I shared with you, at some point, I realized, man, I think I've seen flaws at a greater scale than anybody else I can find in the US government. And, I should tell somebody about this, right? I should learn and try to summarize what I've learned in a way that helps other people. And that last third of my career was about, why are we seeing the same problems over and over again? I don't get it. Why aren't we fixing these? And I really started to be consumed by this, what I now call the translation problem. That is, when we learn from flaws, how do we use it to drive the rest of the machine to fix these flaws, right? To manage ourselves with greater confidence and with greater security. So I started a simple project. I think in my bio, it was mentioned in 2001, recognizing that we're all kind of in this together, right? And again, for me, that's a way of life. It's more than a bumper sticker. So I got permission in 2001 to release all the security guidance that my groups were developing for the Defense Department, for the intelligence community, for the government, out to the public. The early days of the web from the government's perspective, so 2001. And that took me out into the public. People started to ask about it. I get requests to come out and speak, which is a very unusual aspect to an NSA career, at least in those days it was. And what caught me a little bit by surprise was over and over again, I kept asking this, I was asked the same question. What do I do first? And I'll have to admit to you, and this is embarrassing now, but it caught me a little bit by surprise, because it tells the questioner that I never had the responsibility to actually fix any of these problems that I found or that my groups found. Because what do I do first is the natural question for the person who owns the network or has mission or responsibility. My job was to show up like a pro from Dover, point out the problems in other people's systems, give them a pile of PowerPoint, and walk away. This was like by the way, that's great work if you can get it, right? Because finding problems is no great trick, frankly. And it's the domain of really clever people and cool technology. But it's really important to say the reason we find these problems is to empower people to fix them. And that was really, again, I'm embarrassed to say it now, but it was really a revelation for me at the time. So I got permission to release the information we were developing for the government out to the public in 2001. In 2008, though, I was still struggling with this question of what do I do first? So I gathered a group of people, very clever folks, people that worked offense, defense, technology, handful of friends, and phrased the meeting this way: no one leaves the room till we all agree on a small number of things that all of our friends should do. And I will not allow you to do what security people always do. Do not try to solve world hunger at this one meeting or peace in our time, because that's what security pros do, right? They're great at brainstorming 1,000 things, how to introduce a flaw into a system, because that's what we're trained to do, right? We know that stuff. Oh, and here's 50 problems you can fix. I'll give you 50 more. And that's wonderful, right? We need to brainstorm all these things, but it's not very helpful because the poor defender is overwhelmed by these thousands of bad things that you could do or thousands of things that you could do to fix them. So I said, let's keep the number small. And to me, it was 5 to 7 things. Well, we came up with a list of 10 things that we thought were foundational to defense. And believe me, I had no grand ambition. There was a 2-page letter that went to the friends at the Pentagon and various other places. And all I said was, if you don't know where to begin, based on our experience, start here. Well, that note got out into the public and was picked up by something called the SANS Institute, which you might be familiar with, a big teacher of cybersecurity, as well as the acronym on the slide is CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a DC think tank. And they turned it into more of a community project than an NSA project. And it was loosely known for many years as the SANS Top 20. And when I retired in 2012, I wound up taking it back over and spinning it out into a nonprofit. And we loosely use the name, the Critical Security Controls. And we now know it. We're in our permanent home now at the Center for Internet Security starting in 2015, known as the CIS controls or the CIS Critical Security Controls. But this journey has been one of, how do I take this knowledge of vulnerability and translate it into action, right? Not the list of everything you could do, or not a framework or a Sears catalog, or, this is like the sun, moon, and stars here. The idea was not to solve every problem, but to help people focus on the most important problem, from the perspective of attacks. At the end of the day, there's 1,000 things you could dream about or postulate that might happen. But hey, good news, the bad guys are giving us information every day about how they exploit us. And that's the best available information that we have. And so the idea was to figure out how to take best advantage of that. So this is the kind of way to think about it. But conceptually, when I talk about defense, this is the model that I use, what I call the defender's dilemma. And this is important because it sort of frames the rest of my career here. I talk about understanding what's the right thing to do, right? And I made the case for that, at least at an informal level, what we established and what we try to maintain in the critical security controls are the right thing to do is driven by the attackers. They're telling us what they're going to do. And we get to see others suffer and lose money and lose access to their systems. And so we need to figure out what's the right thing to do. And a key question is about how much do I need to do? Because security people have a standard answer, right? How much more do I need to do? No, the answer is clearly more, right? You need to do more because I can daydream 10 more things. But that might be a helpful decision or advice in terms of improving security, but it might be terrible business advice, right? You're not going to bankrupt your company in the name of better security. That's a terrible trade-off. And so you have to juggle. If you're a decision owner, decision manager, business owner, agency head, you're juggling lots of risks, and cyber just happens to be one of them. So you've got to put a cap on, or you need to think at some level about how much do I need to do. And then there's a challenge. How do I actually do it, right? How do I buy stuff, operationalize it, train people to it, build processes around it. We'll go through each of these in just a bit more detail in a second. But so right thing to do, how do I do it? But here's the thing that I observe over the last, let's see, 5-7 years, that's really changing the industry. How do I convince others that I've done the right thing? Right. This is moving, I think now, and the pace is picking up here in the last couple of years, from a technology problem. How do I solve the technology problem of cybersecurity to how do I solve the business problem of cybersecurity? And once you move into that domain, you're dealing in the domain of executives, risk decisions, lawyers, auditors, the legal system, regulators. All of them are trying to find their way in this business now. And so you wind up spending an extraordinary amount of time convincing others that you have done whatever it is they ask for. I'll go through this in a bit more detail. But, and if you could sort of magically decide where you spend your time, you actually want to spend most of your time on the right thing to do and how do I do it, right? The first two actions, because those are important, but it's easy to get stuck there. You'd like to spend as little as possible, frankly, convincing others you've done the right thing. So how do we do that? But what's happening, I think I can tell you across the industry, is that no enterprise gets to deal with one person looking over their shoulder, right? It'll be the regulator, it'll be the insurance company, it'll be the supply chain partner, it'll be the legal system. And so you're going to find yourself trying to convince others over and over again. And these others often speak different languages at different levels of abstraction. So it's a very challenging thing, and it's starting to eat resources really out of proportion to the value that we all get from it. So let's walk through some of this here. So I gave the example, and there's a multi-year theme that we're working on at CIS about, I'm a recovering math wonk from the early days. And so we all have a dream, any of us who've had a background of this kind of stuff, that we'll use data more effectively to make decisions in this business. And there's lots of great people thinking about this problem across the entire industry. But I gave you the story of how the first list that became the CIS controls was created. It was literally 5 geeks in the room, right? 5 friends. Let's think about this and let's argue until we agree on something and we'll write it down. Okay, well, this is a hidden secret. Most of the security frameworks and recommendation lists you see out there in the industry, that's pretty much how they're created, right? You get the opinion of some really smart people typically that you can't hire, that you'd love to hire, but you get the benefit, and here's the good news, you get the benefit of their experience, right? That's been documented or put into a framework or a tool or whatever. But there's a lot of, the repeatability, the scaling, not so high, right? Because you pick 5 different geeks, you might get a different answer depending on their experience. So my goal has been to move us across this spectrum left to right. And once the project moved to the SANS Institute, I'd say conceptually, it became 5,000 geeks on a mailing list. That's one of the powerful things about a big company like SANS, is that they're connected to so many really amazing people across the industry. So it went from a small number of people writing a 2-page piece of paper to thousands of people contributing ideas and it all being brought together. Now, it's very challenging because there's a lot of really smart but really opinionated people in this business. So you got a lot of data, but also a lot of controversy. But SANS did a great job of pulling that into something small and manageable. When I took it back over after retirement, I started to look around to say, well, hey, we actually have some data out there. Now, the data is not in raw data format, it's in summary format. And many of you, I'm sure, read things like the Verizon data breach report and the equivalent from Palo Alto and McAfee and Symantec and companies like that. They have amazing data scientists. They have lots of data that's generated from their business model. And so the first one I worked with was Verizon, to say, let's work together on they have all this data. They collected all the great data scientists analyzing it, come up with summaries. Let's take those summaries and map them or compare them to the recommendations that we're making at CIS. Because why would someone read the Verizon data breach report, for example? Well, they want to translate it, right? That's the key verb, translate it into action. Do they have to do it by themselves? Well, no. Why don't they band together with 5,000 geeks and do it with friends? And that's in effect what we did, was pull together these big authoritative tax summaries, right? The statement of the problem out there. And through volunteerism and through worldwide reach, pull together opinions to how do I map them into positive, constructive things. We started to reinforce that work with honeypots and people doing testing and experimentation. We haven't made it, by the way, to the far end of the scale yet, but you'll see we're at the 3/4 mark and counting. So, but the notion here is to bring more leverage, right, greater scale and repeatability to this process of making recommendations. And we should all be demanding this kind of information. We demand this kind of information in everything from public transportation to public health, by the way. Most of it's under the hood. You don't see it, right? You know that your airplane, you expect that your airplane that you're going to fly on has been built according to real specifications, inspected by inspectors, piloted by certified pilots who are retrained and reauthorized, et cetera, et cetera. But most of it you don't verify. You believe that it's built into the system. And that's where we need to get in terms of a great deal of this cybersecurity stuff. So I'm going to run you briefly through a model that we call the community defense model. And it's not to overwhelm you, but it's to kind of show you where we are on that left to right spectrum here. And again, the idea, when I think about what we should be doing at CIS, I look around for the problems that every enterprise seems to have to solve, but they're struggling to solve on their own. So I'm looking for community problems, right? Things that we have in common. As I said, this is one of my lessons learned. We have more in common than different. So this is the way we think of it now. We've been through a couple of iterations of this, and we're getting more mature at it. But the notion is, in the upper left of this silly diagram, I mentioned these data sources, right? These sources of information about what attackers are doing, their trade craft, what the victims look like, and so forth. And there's lots of data. It's not normalized. It's all of all different types produced by different vendors. But it turns out, at least at a summary and trend level, so much of it is in the public. And by the way, at CIS, we are also a data source. I mentioned we are the home of the multi-state ISAC. So we are tracking the activities, monitoring and supporting, as I mentioned, 14,000 member state, local, tribal, territorial governments. So we have our own sources that we contribute, and the summary of that goes to the Verizon Data Years report. So we have data that we can pull from partners, and we are in ongoing discussion with many of these big threat intelligence companies. What's emerged in the last few years is something called the Mitre attack framework. And this is in the range of geeky, but think of it this way. Think of what Mitre has done. And Mitre is a government-sponsored think tank that I've worked with for decades. And they're doing this as a community project, not for us, but we're a part of their coalition that helps define what this does. The attack framework looks at all these thousands of attacks also, and tries to break out what I call, they don't call it this, what I call the atomic elements of attack, right? All the individual actions that an attacker could do, all the data that they could use, all the bits and pieces that make up attacks. There's been plenty of analysis and study of this kind of thing. And what you can do once you have this, remember, almost all attacks are repeats of old patterns, right? These are the elements that make up patterns. These are the pieces that are part of some attack pattern. Not all, but of some. What this gives you is a model. So a model is a way to organize lots of data into something that you can analyze, make sense of, test, experiment with, and so forth. And so we pull these sources together, this data, the modeling, and as I said, the important verb to us is translate. How do I translate it into action? How do I translate it into things like the CIS controls, the CIS benchmarks, and all kinds of other things? I'll show you how we do that in just a second. But this is the overview conceptually of what we do. This is really about that first step of the defender's dilemma, right? How do I know what to do? How do I figure out the important things to do? So as we walk through this process that I just described, we went to all those different sources, the Verizon report, the MSISAC data, Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, and probably the top 7 to 10, I think something like that. And what we were trying to do was not look at all the data, but pull out what they identified as the most important or the top types of attack, right? The types of data, the types of attacks, I'm sorry, that the data has described to us. And it turns out across all those reports, there's a very high degree of commonality or agreement about, at this type level, what are the attacks we should be worrying about? What are the ones that have the most detriment to the community, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the 5 that came out. And these attack summaries don't always use the same language. So sometimes we have to kind of peel out a couple of things into 2 separate things so they can compare them to others. But this is what we wound up with. And none of these are a surprise to any of you, right? These are the things that you would say, yep, somewhere in my top 5 to 10, these are all in there somewhere. And these are some of the data sources. I did not update the dates on here, but we stay in touch with these folks regularly. So when this slide was done, it was actually for the 2020 reports for 2021 summary. But these are just typical. I've mentioned a number of these here. And what do you get from that? Well, I won't go through the geeky details, but this idea conceptually, and you can, if you like, just look at the diagram in the upper right here. What we did was look at all these different atomic elements as defined in the Mitre attack framework. We compare them to the controls, right? The recommendations that we have made. We use all this stuff. I'll click this real quick. And what we're doing is we identify these attack types. We use Mitre attack as kind of, I'll call it a language. That's not quite right, but it's close enough, to construct what we call patterns, right? From a type of attack like ransomware, we use the attack framework to lay out the atomic elements that would be used in that attack type, okay? And then now that we have the atomic elements, say, of ransomware, we compare it to this mapping we have done of the lowest level in the attack framework against what we call a safeguard, the lowest level of recommendation. What you're trying to do here is establish value. That is, when we recommend a very specific thing, what value does it give the defender against a specific part of an attack pattern or an attack type that I care about, right? What value does this recommendation give you against, say, this piece of ransomware? That's the kind of question that we want to be able to answer repeatably and reliably about any kind of a pattern of attack, right? And it's been hard in the past because we have counted so much on this wizardry model, right? This sort of gut feel that these are good things to do. But if you want to build repeatability around these things, you have to kind of go down to this level. So I don't want to overwhelm you with detail, but think of it as putting rigor under the hood. You know, when sometimes I'll just share it with you. I don't use it in the slide. I call this the DIRT approach: data, right? Repeatability and transparency. And sometimes I'll use rigor instead of repeatability. But the idea there is we want to base recommendations on real data about real attacks. We want rigor in the way we map from one to the other. And then we want to be transparent about it so that we can argue about it, right? We're not removing judgment and experience. We're just bounding it. We're putting it in a place where experts can argue not about sort of vague nebulous things, about specific value of defenses against specific bad guy activity. So that's the world that we're moving towards now, at least the CIS. And I think lots of folks are thinking about this in the same way that we are. So we have all this. We talked about these attack types. We talked about how to translate them, establish value. So what does value mean? Again, without boring you with the geeky stuff, it's really about, if I implement a recommendation that CIS says, how does it help me against these different attack patterns? And if I implement everything or some subset of what CIS says, what value does it give me against lots of attacks, whole bundles of attacks, right? And these are the kind of numbers that our analysis are bringing up here. That is, you know, if you implemented sort of everything we tell you to do, that's very loosely stated, you know, you get lots of value, right? Most of the attack, what are called sub-techniques in the modeling language, are blocked or monitored or mitigated or, you know, et cetera, by these safeguards. And if you've worked in the industry for a while, this is a pretty intuitive result. That is, there is very high value to sort of basic good practices. You'll hear the term cyber hygiene a lot in the business. And that is, you know, the things that we know we should do give us not perfect value, but lots of value. That is, we're kind of edging in on that thing I talked about earlier, the 80-20 rule. That is, most of your value comes from basic foundational first 20 steps kind of a thing. That's the notion here. And it seems to be reinforced pretty strongly by the data, no matter how we look at it. The lower part of that blue box, implementing all of what we call IG1 safeguards. That's our, we're one of the few places I think I can state with confidence that has a real formal definition of cyber hygiene. We call it essential cyber hygiene, right? Cyber hygiene, I sometimes call the most quoted but least defined term in the business. You know, we need more cyber hygiene. For example, patching, we should patch better. Well, that's a good example, but that's not a definition. And if you don't have a definition, you can't plan a campaign, you can't provide tools at scale, et cetera, et cetera. So we thought it was essential to have a really rigorous, specific definition. We called it IG1 or implementation group 1. So the idea there, if these are essential steps, how much value do I get from them? If I just do those, and those are, again, seen as the foundation or the starting point, Again, look at the numbers 63, 77, and don't get too hung up on the numbers, but the even analysis by hand would give us essentially those same numbers. So again, it reinforces the notion, but it also does it in a way that is based on real data, has rigor, repeatability, and transparency kind of all built into it. And if you don't like the data that we use, you can follow the same process and use your own data, right? There's nothing prevents you from doing that. And we've put all this out in the public. So that was a bit long, but it was all about the right thing to do. A couple of quick comments here about how do I actually do it, right? So it's lovely to be told or to do the analysis to figure out, these are the most important steps to block the attacks that are really being seen in my industry, for example, or that my regulator requires. But how do I actually do it? And once you get to the how question, now you're talking about buying things, installing them, right, building workflow around them, and you're now putting in place and managing your machine, right? You have to maintain it. So these are the kind of natural questions that people struggle with. Right? I mentioned the how do I get started? I don't know about you, but no enterprise I've met gets to throw away everything they have and start from scratch, right? It doesn't make sense economically. So you've got to figure out, is there value in what I already own? How do I prioritize? How do I learn from others? I think one of our lessons is that most of us learn best from folks that are like us, right? Situated similarly to us, and who can give me some lessons. How did you convince the boss? Where did you spend your first dollars? The problem is, can you find those people? That's really been the trick. And so part of this is bundling it together in a way that can help you learn from others. The training part, the measure of progress, right? Security, as I said, is a machine. So there's no nirvana or end state when you're done. It's all about progress. Can I move towards a desirable state, a state with good security properties? And I want to know when I'm moving away from that. There's sort of entropy or things that decay, you might say, in network security. Because a lot of times, hey, people make changes all the times to systems, right? Whether you realize it or not. So security is never static. Even if you've done all that effort to get to a place, you often wind up kind of decaying through inadvertent things, upgrades and putting in place a patch and a new user who doesn't follow your process. All these things are happening constantly. So measurement is absolutely critical to anything that we do in defense because there's no ending here. A big theme for many now is about automation. Because a lot of this is not magic, right? This is about good IT management. If you look at the kind of recommendations that come out of CIS or any responsible security framework, you're going to see things like inventory of my hardware and software. What programs do I have running? Who has permission to install new ones? What administrative privileges do individual users have? And how do I know when that changes, right? This is, we think of them as security things because I'm a security guy, but that's IT management. And there's no reason why you wouldn't automate a lot of that, right? So you get scale, you get cost management, and so forth. So it's really important to think of this holistically. And these are all the things that go into this business of how do I actually do security or put in place. So these are just some of the things that we have done at at CIS to make this possible for you. Our goal at CIS, we're not building the best list in the business. We think it's really good, but this is really about helping you achieve the good intentions, right? The things that the list calls for. So this implementation group I mentioned, I walked you through the community defense model, use cases that we collect are a way for you to learn from others. Workbench is our place. You can have an account on there. That's where the content is created. That's where people talk about these things. And think of it as a social media platform that we manage to sort of control and put in one place all the conversations about our products. We build self-assessment tools that we give away, and controls the last thing on there, the assessment specification is about when vendors take our ideas and content and embed it into their tooling, which is a really great thing. How do you know that they've correctly done it? Well, we provide that through a specification. A couple of other things. I mentioned this is the thing that's eaten a lot of energy now and will continue to do so. It's about how do I convince others? As I said, a lot of this is about transparency, right? How do I not only figure out what to do, build my roadmap to get there, buy the stuff, but also explain. A lot of this is not about you convincing the auditor or you convincing the regulator. It's about pointing to something neutral, or it's something that says, this is what the community says I ought to do given my circumstances. And so a lot of this, I'm sorry, I've lost one thing here. Oh, is about convincing others. So I talked about a number of these things here, and they're part of how you do things, but also how you assess, how you share that. If you're really interested in this, I'll give you a pointer or two at the end. CIS RAM, the risk assessment method, is the way to sort of build the what's called affirmative defense, or make a case to a regulator or a lawyer or a judge, particularly, that you've done responsible, reasonable things. We have these other things. We also provide cross mappings to security frameworks. I mentioned that it's the rare enterprise that only has to deal with one person looking over their shoulder. To make that easier for you to manage, we provide cross mappings essentially to every security framework that we can find on Earth. And I know we do that because it's my son that leads that for us at the Center for Internet Security. So this is his starter job in the cybersecurity business. We want to make it clear, hey, if you like our work and want to use it for your technical roadmap, but you need to report in the language of the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, we'll make that easy for you. You want to deal with ISO 27000, here's the mapping that we have. And name the other framework that's out there, and we'll provide that for you. If we don't have it, we'll create it for you. So there's a lot going on here. And, as I thought about security frameworks and how they do things, right? I think we need to rethink a lot of what's going on out there in this security framework business. Frameworks are not magic, right? They are just a way to think about the problem, gather data, make decisions, execute on them, and keep that going. And so they should have all these kinds of attributes. They should and we've tried to build these attributes into the work that we do. So, and I've hit most of these for you. They should be based on data, measurement, this notion of transparent, freely available principles, independently vetted content, an ecosystem of resources to help you get there, be aligned with other security frameworks. Frankly, every security framework, or every responsible person or person responsible for a security framework, ought to be thinking about these things and making them available to you, because that's part of what we're doing, right? Most of these frameworks started sort of implicitly saying, well, I'm the only framework on Earth that these adopters have to deal with, so I can ask for all these stuff in a unique language, in a unique way, et cetera. But that's not the world we're living in now. We really need to think about this in a way that sort of minimizes the cost of compliance or the cost of reporting, and do it in a way that is machine friendly and scalable. So a couple of last things, since based on time, if you don't mind, I'm just going to share a couple of things with you, kind of where I think things are going. I didn't mention this earlier, but if you needed, and you should need, a trusted source of how should I configure my Windows desktops, or my Checkpoint firewall, or my Oracle version of Linux, or et cetera. If you don't start with what we have freely available to you at CIS, I don't know where you're starting, because this represents the work of some of the most amazing talent in the industry, and we give it away. The company was founded on this idea. What you get for free is essentially a PDF version, you might say, a readable version that you can now use to configure and manage your own systems. Our membership model is, if you pay us to be a member, you get tools and that kind of stuff. But you can also get this built into the tooling that you get from many of the major security vendors. If you've moved to cloud environments, we support all the major cloud vendors that you can see in the upper left there. You want to configure 1,000 desktops, the Windows desktops, the CIS recommended way. You don't need us. Go right to AWS. Go to Azure. Go to IBM, and they have essentially worked on an agreement where they get that directly from us. But this is a big part of what we do also, and it was really the basis for how the company was founded. Then a couple last things, just sort of trending, because many of you work in regulated industries, I'm sure, and have to worry about these things. This sort of trend in cybersecurity policy, I think, is coming big time, and it has a lot of momentum. And you'll see these terms in regulation, legislation. You'll see it in insurance questionnaires: reasonableness, cost-effective, risk-based decision-making. This is what's happening, right? And this is challenging but good. It's the move from you will have a perfect technical solution to you'll address these issues. This moves it closer, this whole business of cyber, to this notion of risk decision-making for a business or for an agency. And so this is really in the big deal category in the world that I'm looking at now. Some of this is now, and these are just examples of how this notion in particular of reasonable security is creeping into basically every state. The notion of reasonable security practice, reasonable steps, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you are not a lawyer, and I am not, it may surprise you to recognize that reasonable is not actually defined in these statutes, right? That's not the purpose. They don't define them. There's a sort of legal process that sort of thinks through, and this discussion of reasonableness, is an argument and a complex issue on its own. But it's important to know, we track and we're involved with discussion with many of these folks about what does reasonableness then mean in terms of technical safeguards, right? In terms of the work that CIS does, and can we help you if you have to deal with these things? Can we help you make the case that you have acted reasonably? That's where we're really focused at CIS. The other thing that's happening, I'll close with, is incentivized adoption. So Ohio is the pioneer, and we're working closely with them. This notion of, rather than try to mandate, you do business here and you will use these security practices, right, through a regulatory mandate. The model that's emerging that's acceptable sort of in today's times is incentivized adoption. In Ohio, they pioneered it, which is really about, if you can demonstrate, right, this reasonableness using recognized practices as found in things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, and they mentioned specifically the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, and have an implemented, a written implemented information security program, then you get protection, right, against lawsuits. It's a safe harbor kind of activity. Utah has a similar one, because it uses the term, the legal term, affirmative defense, right? You can assert an affirmative defense against certain lawsuits. Connecticut is similar, and we're in close discussion with them, but it's about a cap on punitive damages. So each of them provides some incentive for you having a security plan moving towards recognized standardized security framework. So this is a real interesting topic, and it's really how change is happening across the nation. One reason I'm interested in this, I'll be part of a panel giving a talk on this at the RSA conference in June, if you like this sort of thing. The RSA, as I mentioned, is the largest trade show in the business, but it's about what's happening in the states around cyber incentive and how states are trying to create momentum in improving security, not in a sort of traditional mandatory regulatory way, but in an incentivized adoption way. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Share with you a couple of things. It's been a pleasure. I wanted to give you it was a pretty fast paced, I know. Tried to avoid the uber geekydom, but focus on the things I think would be of interest to you about this notion of the fog of more, right? It is real. It overwhelms us. Even people that do this for a living struggle to keep up with all the news and the crisis of the month. And many of you are drowning in things like Log4j and SolarWinds, if that's part of your life. And so, but in a foggy, complicated environment, it's even more important to focus in on sort of core things that are in common, foundational elements of defense. And you have to survive to fight another day, right? You got to deal with a crisis. But none of these foundational problems get better on their own. They don't age well either. And so the quicker we can get to the sort of better IT management integrated with security, higher automation, move towards things, activities, problems that are driven by data, so that we focus our priority in the right fashion, the better off we're going to be. And this is really an important part of what we do at CIS, and where I hope to spend my last stretch here in my second career, trying to make things easier for folks like you. So with that, I will be glad to wrap up, turn it back over to our host. I'll be glad to take any questions that you have. Either, I think I have access to the Q&A window. And I see one popping up in chat. If you don't mind, I'll just go ahead. And Aaron, if you wanted to take off the presentation, actually, I will stop sharing.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And it does, look like we've got a comment in there. Given the current challenges today, do you think there will ever be a security layered internet with more trusted layers on it, similar to the layered network, or similar to trusted closed with the SEMI closed systems? A lot of terms in there that I'm like, so I hope that.
No, that's all right. It's a wonderful question. So I'd say there's a national debate that has been simmering for a few years, right? So what do I expect an individual enterprise to do, and what should be provided, I'll say loosely, by infrastructure? So if we counted on every enterprise to try and solve this problem and build layering, and okay, I can build this, the top end enterprises, typically the high-end financial institutions who have money, could take a lot of this on, or the big, the Googles and those kind of companies. But here's a bedrock principle for us at CIS. Most of our economy cannot defend itself under the current sort of build it yourself model. It's unsustainable. Most of the companies that we deal with in state and local governments, they'll never hire a cybersecurity professional. They can't think in these architectures like this. But things like this, right, sort of thought through, that could be done at the service provider level, at the infrastructure level, are really powerful. And so there's lots of discussions about this that allow people to kind of get the benefit of these kinds of more complicated. The reason to have security layering, right? Some of this does, and I hate to drop the buzzword of the day, but it's really important, is zero trust, right? A lot of this, you don't want to build these sort of traditional gates, moats, wall kind of structures. You want to build these things that allow you to build paths from trusted things that you have to trusted things that are there, right? The trust becomes a negotiated condition as opposed to a built condition. So I grew up in trust is built, right? You use a trusted operating system, only cleared people get to be on your system. You only talk to other people that have similar security levels as you do. Those days are gone. And so this is more about negotiating trust dynamically. And you have to do that from these sort of common elements. So this more dynamic layering, there's been lots of research on this over the last couple of decades. But so I'd say a lot of these are possible and within reach of technology now. But what's really kind of holding a lot of things back are the economics, frankly. That it might technically be possible, but there's no economic incentive or there's no basis for people choosing to do that except the very well-resourced. So some of that's going to have to come from community action, right? Whether it's the federal level or the state level or the vendors deciding that this is part of it. And so, I'm sorry, that was a bit of a roundabout way to the question, Bob, but I think that was it's a great one. And for me, it triggers this thinking about most enterprises will never be able to even think of these kind of mechanisms. But at the infrastructure level, I know we could. And we could see that as part of the modernization of the way we think of communications. So, and will the CIS controls map to 800-2? Almost certainly yes. I can't tell you right offhand the status of that, but if you check with me afterwards, I'd be glad to look into it. But yes, we track all that. Because of my prior career, we stay in touch with and do our very best to stay in sync with anything that NIST does. So that is a given. Before COVID, we would meet actually once a quarter, face to face in the area here to talk about where they were going, so that we could help stay in sync with that. But yes, you can assume that anything this does, we will map to, if not immediately. The goal was to have it sort of on day one, to work with them up close. We're also engaged in that discussion of how to build maps in machine-friendly ways. Something better than we all know the universal GRC tool for the industry is something called Excel. And that's just not going to cut it for the future. So NIST has been working for years around machine formats for expressing recommendations or controls. And that will greatly simplify the way we map to them, and that folks like you can use multiple frameworks or multiple control lists, for example. So the answer is yes, but reach out to me if you're interested in that kind of thing. Well, I didn't mention, you can either reach me through the cisecurity.org website. You can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm an easy get there. And if you do that, then I will definitely reply at some point. And for all its flaws, LinkedIn is a good way to make an initial contact, and I will always respond to that. But I'm very findable and always happy to engage in these kind of questions for anybody that's been in one of my audiences. Any other questions or any other things that I can answer? Happy to take on, or be happy to take your questions at another time, or pester any of the hosts here that I have. I'm always happy to take questions downstream.
We'll give everybody a few moments. I know we're at the top of the hour here to just put any final thoughts in there, but we do appreciate so much, Tony, taking the time out of your day, and everybody here with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to just try to find our way through the fog a little bit more and lifting it out. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And as mentioned, you've got contact information for Tony, but if you want, reach out to myself or Scott with IP Services. We're happy to get you guys connected in that way, but we do appreciate your time so much and look forward to the next opportunity where we can all gather together again. So thank you, everyone. All right, take care. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.